What's this one? Do Canadians really defer to authority? I don't know. That's what I feel like too. I might be wrong about it. It's like Canadians historically, they went with the Queen and Great Britain. I think it was the King back then. Instead of going with the rebellion in the United States. Well, we would have become just states of the United States if that wasn't the case. I don't know if it would have been so different. I don't know if the French would have if French-speaking people would have lasted as long. Maybe even longer. Maybe a part of the United States would speak French too. I don't know. We'll never know.
This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Hello, friends. My name is JJ, and one of the biggest stories here in Canada at the moment is this issue of Chinese interference in our last two elections. Over the last few months, the Canadian news media has been publishing a number of very sensationalistic stories about an apparent plot by the Chinese government to help Prime Minister Trudeau win re-election, supposedly because they view him as a better ally than the opposition Conservative Party, which has been making anti-China rhetoric a pretty big part of their brand these days. Anyway, these stories generated a lot of interest, as you can imagine. And the Trudeau government faced a lot of pressure to do something. And in March, the Prime Minister agreed to do something. He appointed a guy named Dr. David Johnston to get to the bottom of these allegations. And I find what happened next to be an interesting little case study of a certain theory of Canadian identity and culture, namely the Canadian theory of deference to authority. But before we get into that, let us just hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Brilliant. Hello, friends. So this video was indeed brought to you by Brilliant, the wonderful STEM education website. Do you ever feel self-conscious about the gaps in your knowledge? Like that there are certain important topics in this world about which you know nothing, but you're also afraid to start learning because you are worried that you are so far behind that even a beginner book would be too intimidating and boring. Well, Brilliant exists for people like you. Their online courses are extremely user-friendly and have an intimidation factor that is basically zero, meaning that even if you are an absolute novice to topics like physics or algebra or AI, you will still be able to find their courses easy and enjoyable. This is because they tend to be very visual and gamified with short, interactive lessons that get you to learn by doing, pushing, pulling, dragging, dropping, and all the rest of it. No boring walls of text to read here. I had long wanted to get a better understanding of how computer coding works, for instance, and now I do, because I did their cool little course where you had to code this little drone character to move to these different colored barns. Forgive me for dusting off an old chestnut, but Brilliant really knows how to make learning fun. And if you want to have fun learning, why not head over to brilliant.org/JJ for a 30-day free trial. And the first 200
like thinking is
sign up
close
will get 20% off Brilliant's
microphone
annual premium subscription
is like
as well. Brilliant, the best way to learn.
His signature.
Deference to authority is a term used to describe a tendency to trust and accept
Maybe I should get one of those.
and actions of established authority figures without a lot of criticism or pushback. Among cultural theorists and anthropologists, it is common to argue that some peoples and cultures are more deferential to authority than others, and that this may in fact be one of the main variables that distinguishes cultures and people from each other. So, for example, Catholics are often stereotyped as being more deferential to authority than Protestants, and Japanese people more deferential than Americans. And of course, in these cases, the explanations seem straightforward enough. The Catholic Church is organized in a very top-down sort of way compared to the Protestant churches. The Japanese have a history of living under much more oppressively hierarchical governments and social codes than Americans, and so on. Canadians, for their part, are often described as being in the high deference to authority camp, often by Canadians themselves. But you don't have to take my word for it. Here are a few random quotes I plucked from the pages of Canada's
States,
biggest
probably.
newspapers. Collectively, Canadians defer to authority without coercion. There is a deference to authority that exists in Canada. By our nature, Canadians tend to defer to authority. Further proof of Canadians' passive and polite deference to authority. Canadians are generally unduly and dangerously deferential to authority. We defer to authority. And so on. If we were making a list of the top cliches of Canadian conventional wisdom, this one would be near the top. I remember when I was growing up, there was even this joke you would often hear that went like this. How do you get 100 Canadians out of a swimming pool? Say, everyone out of the pool. And from this perspective, the Prime Minister's decision to appoint Dr. Johnston as head of a fact-finding investigation into allegations of Chinese interference in Canadian elections makes a lot of sense. Dr. Johnston, after all, is basically a Canadian authority figure par excellence. It is hard to even fully describe what he is aside from a professional Canadian authority figure. Born in Ontario and educated at all of the best schools, Johnston worked as a professor as a young man before climbing through the ranks to become president of two of Canada's most prestigious universities. During his decades as one of the grand dames of the Canadian academic establishment, Johnston was appointed
obviously a Mason.
all sorts of high-profile boards and commissions and things in both the private and public sector. The government gave him all sorts of medals for being such a great guy, and in 2010, he got the nation's highest honor of all when he was made Governor General of Canada, the British monarch's personal representative on Canadian soil. Wow. As independent special rapporteur, David Johnston brings integrity and a wealth of experience.
That's really
and
a
skills,
sellout
and I am confident that he will conduct an impartial review to ensure all necessary steps are being taken to keep our democracy safe and uphold and strengthen confidence in it, Trudeau said. Trudeau's entire handling of the China affair to date, in short, has rested heavily on the premise that if he could find an impressive enough authority figure to look into the matter, the public's anxieties could effectively be put to rest. They would defer to that guy's authority, in other words. When the American War of Independence broke out in 1776, a significant chunk of Americans, maybe as high as a quarter, were opposed to it. After the war was won in 1783, many of these opponents, called Tories in the political language of the time, moved back to England, but somewhere around 45 to 50,000 of them fled to the part of North America that was still under British rule.
Ontario.
The collection of colonies we now call Canada. This wave of Tory migrants greatly swelled the population of the Canadian colonies, which up until then had relatively few people. In Canadian parlance, they became known as the Loyalists, with 1783 at one time being seen as Canada's symbolic founding date, the same way 1776 was for America. In 1983, Canada celebrated the 200th anniversary of the Loyalist landings, with festivities in some of Canada's oldest cities and a royal visit by Prince Charles and Princess Diana. The Loyalist migration has long been cited as
population number. There was that many before.
Theory about the kind of society that Canada is and was supposed to be. It is a heavily ideological theory that defined the Loyalists in terms of the Tory political agenda, which is to say the Loyalists are taken to be a people who loved being ruled by the British Crown more than they loved independence and democracy, and therefore a people that desired a country that maintained the more conservative social and political order that existed in pre-revolutionary America. As Canadian author Walter Stewart says in this book, True Blue, the Loyalist Legend. Because of the Loyalists, the independent nation that emerged had a distinct and different flavor. More royalist, more British, more hierarchical, and less inclined to kick over the traces. The sort of nation, in other words, that would have nothing but deference and respect for a former emissary of the crown telling the plain people what was going on with the Chinese, right? Well, spoiler alert, that is not, in fact, what happened. Prime Minister Trudeau's appointment of Governor General Johnston as an independent rapporteur was in fact massively criticized from the start, and criticized, get this, precisely because Dr. Johnston was such a proud and respected scion of the Canadian establishment. The head of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, immediately blasted Johnston as an out-of-touch elitist who was not to be trusted.
Probably.
In part because he was too close
he
to
was
the
right again.
Trudeau family. The Trudeau family, of course, being another great pillar of the Canadian establishment.
He He is Justin Trudeau's ski buddy, his cottage neighbor, his family friend, and a member of the Trudeau Foundation. He has a fake job, and he's unable to do it impartially.
A scornful term you read a lot in the editorial pages in reference to Johnston was Laurentian elite, which is a phrase you sometimes hear in this country.
Bullets fired from Polyev.
That Canada's ruling class consists of a small clique of friends and families in the Laurentian region of Canada, which is to say the Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa part. On May 23rd,
The whole of
Johnston
Canada.
released his report on the state of Chinese interference in Canadian democracy, and he basically concluded that much of the media's reporting on the issue had been overblown, based on facts that were either presented out of context or could not be independently verified. He said he was confident that the Trudeau administration had acted in the appropriate way whenever instances of attempted Chinese election meddling were brought to their attention, and that no serious harm to Canadian democracy had been done. For all of the skepticism that greeted Johnston's appointment,
Nobody likes
the
Trudeau
release of
and he
his
wins
report
all the
only
time.
made things worse. The
But
opposition
whatever.
New Democratic Party moved swiftly to introduce a motion in Parliament demanding Dr. Johnston be immediately fired from his job as special investigator, saying they had no faith in his credibility.
The special rapporteur can no longer continue to do his work.
In his place, the NDP called for a public inquiry into Chinese interference, with the investigation being conducted in an open, public forum, with witnesses giving testimony on live TV and all of the rest. In other words, a system where Canadians wouldn't simply have to take some retired university president's word that everything was above board. The parliamentary motion passed easily, with only Trudeau's party opposed.
David Johnston is an eminent Canadian who has served this government and this country for decades.
As I film this, Dr. Johnston is trying desperately to hang on, but his reputation appears to be in tatters. He is very opposed to this idea of a public inquiry, and seems genuinely taken aback that people have regarded him with such suspicion and derision, that they have been so unwilling, in other words, to defer.
Some of the great
Well,
mansions of the
Maybe if you were Trudeau, like, people aren't going to trust you.
as evidence of the wealth they were able to accumulate.
In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Loyalist legend helped justify the creation of a government in the Canadian colonies that was deeply regressive and anti-democratic. Power was concentrated in the hands of a small, unelected council of men who advised the British-appointed governor. These were usually men that had come from very well-off Tory exile families, wealthy landowners, clergymen from the Church of England, aristocrats from the lesser nobility. These were the sorts of people that Canada's colonial governments existed primarily to serve. Canadian history books often refer to this political system as the family compact regime, though I have always liked this line that this one guy used, where he referred to the Governor's Council as the 12 old ladies. This system ran Canada for about 50 years, but as the years went on, it became increasingly unpopular with the Canadian people. By the 1830s, there were literal armed uprisings all across the Canadian colonies against it. The growing Canadian middle class, the doctors and lawyers and businessmen and those sorts of people, had particular disdain for it, and many of the leading Canadian intellectuals of the time were quite open in calling for an American-style democratic system of government instead. In the 1840s, Britain finally bowed to popular pressure and permitted the Canadian colonies to be run with a form of parliamentary democracy that is not terribly dissimilar from what's used today.
I declare the motion carried.
So, a big part of the reason why the 12 old ladies style of government didn't work was because the Loyalist myth was bunk. Canadian historians now generally agree that most of the people who fled the American Revolution didn't have Tory politics as their primary motivation, but were simply worried about the consequences of the American Revolution in a more broad, personal, and practical way. They were shopkeepers worried about business, young families worried about safety, ethnic and religious minorities were
And you don't have a boat.
persecution. No one really knew what America's post-revolutionary government would be like, and many feared the worst. There was some post-revolutionary violence against Tories in the United States, but obviously nothing remotely on the scale of what was seen in the aftermath of revolutions in places like France or Russia or Iran. And since we now know that America wound up being a mostly safe and stable democracy, at least from the perspective of the sort of white people who comprise the majority of the loyalists, it is easy to look back and judge the loyalists for being overly paranoid. But the fact that their worst fears were not realized does not mean that we can't at least sympathize with their logic. As the Canadian author Will Ferguson writes, most loyalists weren't as much Tories as they were anti-revolutionaries, and there are always plenty of good reasons to fear a revolution. Were some loyalists true believers in the cause of undemocratic rule by governors and aristocrats? Sure, but many others were perfectly fine with democratic government, which, we should remember, already existed in some form in many of the British 13 colonies. The problem with Canada's post-1783 government was that it granted way too much political power to the most ideologically regressive faction of the loyalist population, who in turn used that power to create a deeply self-flattering, self-justifying mythology about themselves and the supposedly inherent character of the people they ruled. And even though these guys were eventually removed from power, the myth they helped perpetuate about Canadians being a passive people with an almost childlike trust for any and all authority figures still survives as a part of Canadian culture to this day, particularly within the circles of the so-called Laurentian elite we mentioned earlier. As you saw in those newspaper quotes, respectable people still cite the deference to authority cliche all the time as some obviously self-evident fact about the nature of Canada, rooted in our loyalist past. And they do this even though a glance at basically any era of Canadian history, even the loyalist era, I think pretty clearly indicates that this country's culture has been defined as much by resistance to authority as blind deference to it. Now, modern Canada is obviously a mostly stable and prosperous country, inhabited by a mostly satisfied middle-class population. And one of the main characteristics of a middle-class population of that sort is some degree of conservative defensiveness towards the existing social order. Authorities tasked with upholding that social order, in turn, like cops and doctors and businessmen and judges and so on, generally enjoy public respect to the extent that they are seen as protecting a social order that is worth defending. But that said, Canada is also a large and diverse country in which the status quo can be expected to routinely fail some segment of the population from time to time. And I think it is pretty clear that middle-class Canadians have never been particularly shy about contesting the power of authorities whenever that happens. It is a historic phenomenon that's been seen not just in the struggle for democratic government, but in everything from the fight for women's suffrage, to the labor movement, to the founding of new political parties when the old ones seemed unresponsive, to Quebec nationalism, to some of the battles that have defined Canadian politics more recently, like the truckers protesting COVID restrictions.
The United States didn't do anything like that.
Militant pursuit of Indigenous sovereignty. Here is a good quote that I think sums up the sentiment quite well. Freedom is not a gift, but something that must be won. The only freedom is that which has been torn from authority. That is a quote from Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the 15th Prime Minister of Canada, who got his start in politics supporting striking workers in the asbestos mines of Quebec. And the sentiment he is expressing in that quote basically encapsulates a classically Anglo-American conception of liberty as something that can only be ensured by maintaining a perpetually skeptical attitude towards authority. It is an attitude that not all Canadians express all the time towards all authorities, but still one that I think manifests in our culture often enough to make it, in my opinion, a better description of our national character than a dangerously deferential
It's a minority.
or whatever. In short, any Canadian authority figure who comes along and just takes it for granted that his status as an authority will be enough to get everyone to fall in line is making a dangerous miscalculation.
Depends.
It's why I think that for all of his titles and medals and glowing reputation within the Laurentian elite, Dr. Johnston is actually a bad Canadian authority figure because he has failed to grasp this simple fact about the country that he has spent so much of his life trying to serve.
David Johnston just days ago faced opposition MPs demanding his resignation.
I will continue to invite disagreement on my recommendations, but will not be deterred from completing my work.
That changed late Friday with a letter to the Prime Minister. My objective was to help build trust in our democratic institutions, he wrote, but he added, given the highly partisan atmosphere around my appointment and work, my leadership has had the opposite effect. I am therefore tendering my resignation.
All right. Well, I think he had a good points, and he went through a lot of historical facts to go with his idea that Canadians were not pushovers and were not sheep. I don't know. I live here. I'm in Quebec. Might be different in other places in Canada. Probably like quite different. Let's say in Alberta, for example. But here, most people are sheep, from what I understand. It's not that they just don't want any problems, and for them, like following the orders, it's just like the easiest solution to not have any problems. So, like when somebody differs from what's said on TV, what's said by main politicians, and everything, most people will react skeptically. They will, even if they agree with like your opinions or your ideas, because I try to bring good arguments when I can. Well, they still have this greater attachment to to keep what they have. They might not be willing to fight. Like even young people. I mean, of course, young people are more willing to fight. It's always normal, and to erase what was done. But I mean, if there's no big social movement, if the TV doesn't tell them to, if there's no politician that tells them to, if there's no superstar that tells them to, I think Canadians are probably quite passive, and politically they're not passive that like more in their lives or as far as like making a business or anything like that, but so I think that they do adhere to authority, like most of them do. It's just that, like in any society, and I think it's normal, there's always some people that are born, and they're born rebels, and those are the ones that create movements. And sometimes there's a movement that's strong enough. It doesn't take that much. Like if like people see that there's a chance, pretty much, like I don't know if it's conscience or not, probably not. If they think that the rebels have a chance, they will probably join. It doesn't take that much. I'd say like you just need like about 10 to 15% of the people that are willing to change things and are activists, and they can get like a lot of things done as long as their movement is true. As long as their objectives are solid, they're gonna have support from the people. So I think Canadians are like that. They're always gonna try to find like another leader, another ruler. I'd say more ruler. I prefer leaders. I would prefer to be a leader than a ruler. But I think people here, I think they prefer rulers. That's the way most people work. I know like anarchists will never understand it, but like the main part of society, maybe not in all countries, but I think so, they want to be ruled. They don't want to deal with that. They don't want to be abused, of course, and I mean there's a limit to everybody. Maybe some societies more than less, more than others, but yeah, that's the gist of it for that. I'm gonna take a little break here.